Historians of Reddit. What's a devastating event that no one talks about? The year of living dangerously in Indonesia in 1965-66 saw absolute chaos and still has a marked effect on their society. It is possibly one of the largest mass killings of the last century, and I had heard nothing about it ever, living in the West. It's hard to say how many people actually died, but estimates range from 100k to 300k, and even on up to 500k or a million dead. Basically, the Communist Party in Indonesia was heavily influenced by Maoism and ethnic Chinese civilians. It was the largest communist party outside of China. President Sukarno, who had helped the country through Japanese occupation and independence from the Dutch British, had kept the house of cards balanced, but was beginning to be swayed by communist policies. The military, staunchly anti-communist, one and largely supported by the US, would be looking to take power. One night, 6 high-ranking members of the military were abducted and killed. The army spread the word that the communists were to blame and initiated mass reprisals. Killings, torture and imprisonment ran rampant over the islands, and even ethnic Chinese or just suspected communists were taken. Despite working with Sukarno for many years, the US would support his liquidation and the rise of the military. It is unclear how extensive American support to the army was, but it is probable they aided in training and may have even helped compile names of communists to the army. Eventually, a general by the name of Suharto would take power, and Sukarno would be placed under house arrest with no power. Today, the massacres and chaos are not really taught in Indonesian schools, and it's clear that many have not come to terms with what happened. However, the mass killings of possibly a million or more people should rank up there in devastating events. The Carrington event. In 1859, solar flares hit the Earth, causing an aurora borealis effect to be seen all over the world. It lasted for several days, during which time it was reportedly bright enough to read by at midnight. Telegraph operators reported receiving shocks and burns from the devices, and in some cases removed the batteries powering the telegraphs, as signals were being disrupted by the geomagnetic storm. After removing the batteries, the telegraphs still operated, in some cases better than they had when powered. It wasn't particularly devastating at the time, but it's estimated that if a similar storm were to hit us today, it would cripple the entire planet for potentially decades. The estimated repair cost in the US alone is measured in the trillions. In 2012, a similar storm missed the Earth by 9 days. Something that is well known but not that much is the Guaiana accident in Brazil, where cesium-137 was handled by many people, including children. It is regarded as the worst radioactive incident to happen in Brazil. It was a radioactive contamination accident that happened on September 13, 1987, after a radiotherapy machine from an abandoned hospital was illegally stripped for parts and said parts were stolen. On September 16, one of the thieves opened a cesium capsule, and then on September 18 sold it to a scrapyard. At that same night, the owner of the scrapyard saw a blue glow in the machine's parts, which was the cesium capsule that had been opened. Thinking it might be valuable, he brought it to his home. Over the next 3 days he invited friends and family to see the strange glowing substance. On September 21, one of his friends succeeded in freeing several rice-sized grains of the glowing material from the open capsule. He then started sharing some of them with friends and family. On September 25, the capsule was again sold to another scrapyard. Although 1 day before the sale, more dust was removed from the capsule by the scrapyard owner's brother. The brother then took the dust home and spread it on the concrete floor, where later his daughter would play in, and with the dust she also ate while sitting on the floor, and dust particles fell on her food. Contaminating it, one of the family members of the owner of the first scrapyard noticed that many people around her fell ill, and on September 28, she reclaimed the capsule from the second scrapyard and brought it to a hospital. In the morning of September 29, it was confirmed that the material was radioactive, and the doctors persuaded authorities to take immediate action on the matter. The city, state, and national governments were all aware of the incident by the end of the day. News of the radiation incident was broadcast on local, national, and international media. Within days, nearly 130,000 people went to local hospitals concerned that they might have been exposed. Of those, only 250 were indeed contaminated. Some with radioactive residue still on their skin. 4 of those people died, including a 6-year-old girl. The one that ate food that had been contaminated by dust particles. This is fairly recent. Started in 1998 and ended in 2003, but the Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since WW2, with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. The war was in fact a spillover of what was happening in Rwanda post-genocide. The Rwandan and Ugandan armies invaded Congo, and in the process they forced a large number of Congolese children to become child soldiers fighting for them. A lot of Congolese peasants and Hutu refugees were killed by these armies as retaliation for the 1994 genocide. Today Eastern Congo is still very unsafe, and the belligerents that started the war are still strong US allies. When my mom was in college, she had a Cambodian classmate who was studying with her while his wife and child stayed in Cambodia. When shit started going down, he insisted on returning to Cambodia to get his family out. My mom begged him not to go, and my dad, who was dating my mom at the time and had returned from serving in the Vietnam War just a few years earlier, even offered to go instead to try to get them out. He went anyway. As soon as my mom heard that they were killing the educated people and folks with glasses, she knew she would never see her friend again. He wore glasses. Before he left, he gifted my mom charcoal rubbings he took at Angkor Wat. They are treasured by her to this day, and the only physical evidence she has that her friend existed. I grew up hearing this story. We remember him and his family and pray for them. We may be the only living people who remember them. This was long before I was born, but I will carry his story after my mom passes. We owe it to each other. During WW2, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Adu. On the island was the village of Adu where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were the wife, school teacher and priest husband, who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan, where they worked in POW camps where many died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than soldier POW and almost subhuman because they didn't fight back and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived and they went back home only to find their village burned down. They left the island and it now remains uninhabited, basically driving the Adu tribe to extinction. Years later, the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there, but have yet to apologize to the descendants of the Adu tribe they destroyed. The New London School explosion. On the afternoon of March 18, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, Texas, turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it. Other than the fact that he'd survived until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated. So my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his actually very interesting life, including a big section on the New London School explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. He was in 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom. As 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies. And parts of bodies everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boy started lowering the badly injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath. Most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in so that there was some sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when school started up again, was asked to switch to trumpet as the entire trumpet section had been killed. My grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including Polillo and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Something similar happened in my hometown in 2013. A family had smelled gas on their property and called the local fire department. They, as well as their gas company, came out and neither were able to locate any problems, but they assured the homeowner that there wasn't anything to worry about. A couple of hours later, the father was in the driveway preparing to take his daughter to school. She forgot something inside, went back in and turned on her bedroom light. That light threw a spark and blew the house into pieces. 13 years old, and she died due to the incompetence of the gas company. Her father had run into the inferno looking for his little girl and nearly died himself. His son would have most likely lost his life also had he not skipped school to go deer hunting that morning. Ended up winning a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the gas company for wrongful death. I lived 5 miles away at the time, and not only did I hear the explosion, my garage door came up almost a foot and slammed back down. Such a tragic story. There's so many that I would go with. That will probably be mentioned in other comments, but I think any stories about workers in the early 1900s are pretty horrible. Radium Girls is a pretty horrible event, for example. After being told that the paint was harmless, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip. Some also painted their fingernails, face and teeth with a glowing substance. The women were instructed to point their brushes in this way because using rags or a water rinse caused them to use more time and material, as the rinse was made from powdered radium, gum arabic and water. Many women died and became sick with horrendous diseases. One woman named Molly Maggie had her jawbone crumble. Her dentist thought Molly needed surgery to remove a fast-growing abscess he'd found on her jaw. When he got the gums open, the bone didn't look right as it was too ashy and gray, so he gently prodded it with his finger. To his shock and horror, the whole bone crumbled under his fingertip like ashes in a fireplace. Instead of removing a tumor, he wound up digging Molly's entire left jaw out with nothing but his fingers. Unbeknownst to him, the radium had perforated the bone cells and stripped them of calcium. It had, like a little machine gun, shredded the collagen inside the bone and left it as little more than a pile of splinters. There's also a great book on this called The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of American Shining Women by Kate Moore. This whole story is extremely depressing. Work in the 1800s and early 1900s was pretty horrible for a lot of women, men and children. One thing that doesn't get talked about was more of a phenomenon or major problem than event, and that was how many people died in theater fires due to poor design, combustible materials, few fire exits, and panic. One of the worst was the Iroquois Theater in Chicago. In 1903, which is both the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single building fire in US history, where patrons died after sparks from an arc light set a curtain on fire, then a chain reaction started, exacerbated by failures of the things in place that were supposed to combat fire. The theater had been overbooked to compensate for earlier poor sales, causing some to sit blocking the exits. The fire was immediately worsened when performers opened the stage door to get outside, as it turned the fire into a fireball. Many people were held inside by iron gates that had been put in place to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. As people fled, they tumbled downstairs, trampled each other, and got squashed to death. Their unfamiliarity with the building got them stuck in dead ends and up against windows. Many jumped from fire escapes and died, while those behind them were saved, the bodies of the earlier jumpers cushioning their falls. All in all, 602 people died, many were children. The story is a lot more complicated and sordid with city corruption, etc. The one takeaway is the incident promoted the development and use of the panic bar. The Sand Creek Massacre. US troops slaughtered an unprotected village, which was flying the white flag of surrender at the time, and full of women and children, murdering at least 150, possibly many more of them, almost unspeakably brutally. The victims were Southern Cheyenne who had already ceded their territory in compliance with the US government and had relocated to Sand Creek under US military orders. At the time of the attack, the encampment was flying both the American flag and the white flag of surrender. I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than any I ever saw before. The women cut all to pieces. With knives. Scalped, their brains knocked out. Children 2 or 3 months old. All ages lying there, from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. John S. Smith, Congressional Testimony of Mr. John S. Smith, 1865. I saw one squaw lying on the bank, whose leg had been broken. A soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then left her without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open, with an unborn child lying by her side. Robert Bent, New York Tribune, 1879. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was behind, following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a b. I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. Major Anthony, New York Tribune, 1879. Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of White Antelope, lying solitarily in the creek bed, was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose, ears, and testicles, the last for a tobacco pouch stanhoig. After the smoke cleared, Chivington's men came back and killed many of the wounded. They also scalped many of the dead, regardless of whether they were women, children or infants. Chivington and his men dressed their weapons, hats and gear with scalps and other body parts, including human fetuses and male and female genitalia. They also publicly displayed these battle trophies in Denver's Apollo Theater and area saloons. The Milan Conference. Back in 1880, a bunch of educators of the deaf all decided to meet in Milan to determine how best to teach deaf people. 164 delegates were in attendance, only one of whom was deaf. At the time, there was a conflict among educators of deaf people about whether an oralism or manualism-based approach was better. Proponents of oralism argued that deaf people would never succeed in society if they could not speak and hold a conversation in the same way a hearing person would. To this end, anyone who attempted to sign would be punished, and deaf people were forced to lip-read. At the end of the conference, sign language was banned in all educational institutions, and deaf people were not allowed to teach, for fear that it would encourage the use of sign language. As a result, for roughly 100 years, deaf people were essentially isolated from communication and unable to form communities. To this day, amongst older generations of deaf people, many still have never learned to sign. In addition, deaf culture as a whole was and is profoundly affected by this event because it essentially stole stories that had been passed down from generation to generation, erasing the history of deaf people and the deaf community. The disease outbreaks that hit the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans. You hear about a 90% death rate and it sounds made up, but whatever the actual number was, entire civilizations were literally wiped out. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years are just gone, with barely a record left. You have stories of people coming across whole villages of corpses. These people died never even having seen the Europeans, never knowing what was killing them and their loved ones, and totally helpless to do anything about it. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalapapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969 even after Hawaii officially became a state. The Highland clearances. Over a period of about 150 years between the 18th and 19th centuries, English and lowland Scottish landlords evicted thousands upon thousands of Highland Scots from their ancestral homelands and replaced them with sheep. It's hard to classify as a historical event because it went on for so long and is usually interpreted as an ambiguous series of largely isolated incidents. There were attacks on villages in which the landlords would burn their tenants' houses to the ground to get them to leave and burn their land so that nothing could grow. Multiple people were caught in the fires and died. During the Glencoe massacre, 30 members of Clan MacDonald were murdered by Scottish government forces for supporting the Jacobite uprising. The Irish potato famine also affected the Highland Scots who grew potatoes, and many people starved or were forced to leave as well. As a result, there was a series of mass migration in which Scots traveled to Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the US, and largely lost their language and culture. It's very sad, and all that is basically why Highland culture and language has largely been lost. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, please drop a like, and to stay up to date with my latest videos, make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel by clicking the button under this video.